Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Jensen Steady. I'm a student in Professor Lauer's 20th Century Genocide and Human Rights class, and I'm really honored to present our speaker today. So in our class, we've been reading Adam Jones' masterful textbook on the history of genocide, so I'm just really excited about today. Adam Jones is a professor of political science at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan. Professor Jones received his Ph.D. in political science from the University of British Columbia and has studied all around the world, including studying Mandarin language at East China Normal University. Jones' scholarship on gender and other facets of genocide is truly interdisciplinary and pioneering. His writings have appeared in the Journal of Genocide Research, Feminist Studies, Review of International Studies, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Caribbean Studies, just to name a few outlets. He has authored and edited 15 books since 2002, including the standard textbook in the discipline that I mentioned, which is titled Genocide, A Comprehensive Introduction, which is the book that we're using in our class. Weighs in at about 5 pounds or so, a very hefty text. I think, kind of the weight of that book really demonstrates to us the importance of this subject and also the importance of the future of the subject and how these kind of issues are continuously appearing in our lives today. And I think that's really something to reflect on and think about. So Adam Jones is the founder of Gendercide Watch, which works to raise awareness, conduct research, and provide educational resources on gendercide. Additionally, he's worked as an expert consultant with the United Nations Office on Genocide Prevention, which works to help direct conflict prevention seminars in the Balkans, Switzerland, the United States, Indonesia, and Thailand. Mr. Jones was elected as one of 50 key thinkers on the subject of the Holocaust and genocide by a book project with that same name, and he was the second youngest scholar to be recognized in that group. To top it off, Professor Jones is a widely recognized photographer. He has displayed over 24,000 images taken from over 70 countries on his global photo archive. His lecture today is sponsored by the McGrublian Center for Human Rights, and as a reminder, I just want to remind you to silence your cell phones. No audio or video recording is allowed, and we are going to have time at the end for questions. So without further ado, join me in welcoming Adam Jones.
Well done. That's great. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for coming out to this lunchtime gathering. It's a great pleasure to be at Claremont for the very first time and to have a chance to observe the work of the McGrublian Center and to meet up with Dr. Lauer and Kirsty and the other fine folks here. I'm very grateful to those of you who have been working your way through this monstrous new edition of my textbook. I have brought along some free vouchers for chiropractic treatment for those of you that have been lugging it around campus for the last several months. But what I'd like to do with this talk is basically, I have very limited time, and I always feel frustrated, partly because of the seriousness and severity of the subjects that we're dealing with whenever we talk about genocide and crimes against humanity. There's always something that feels a little surreal as you flip through one slide after another, which is actually referencing such an intensity of dark events and themes and dynamics. Nonetheless, I would like to talk today a little bit about some of the dynamics that are involved, as I see them, in the theme of gender and genocide broadly viewed. And if I have made any contribution to this subject over the last 20 or 25 years, I think it has perhaps been at that level of inclusiveness. Most of my, I would say, most significant essays on the subject are compiled in this book, Gender Inclusive Essays on Violence, Men, and Feminist International Relations. And that title, Gender Inclusive, including women and men, girls and boys, LGBTQI, etc., is crucial, I think, in order to grounding ourselves in the discussion of gender and mass crimes. I should also mention, somewhat controversially, that I tend to use gender in a rather catch-all way, which violates to some extent the more consensus approach these days of drawing sharp distinctions between biological or physiological sex on the one hand and gender as a form of social construction on the other. I think when you actually examine that, I don't have the time to do it here, but I think those distinctions are in fact quite permeable. And together with Joshua Goldstein in his important book, War and Gender, I tend to use gender to cover masculine and feminine roles and bodies alike in all their aspects, including the biological, cultural structures, dynamics, roles, and scripts associated with each gender group. As an example of that, then, when you talk about something, as unfortunately one often does in genocide studies, one talks about the gendering of a mass grave, for example. And for me, that means not only the physiological properties of the beings that are brought to that location, but also refers to the cultural scripts and understandings that put them there or led them to be killed and to be buried in a mass grave. So just keep that in mind. I think we can actually see in this definition of the term that has been at the heart of my own research on this, it's not my own term, Marianne Warren's concept of gendercide from the mid-1980s. And if you look through that definition, you can see her actually going back and forth between these terms, gender and sex, and blurring them somewhat in the definition. Gendercide is a sex-neutral term, for example. So this, I think, is an approach that has been used at least for some time. Warren's concept, I think, is very important, partly because she was the first to really examine gender, the targeting according to gender, as a form and strategy of genocide. And although her book, as I think is quite typical of feminist writings on this subject, spends most of its time talking about female-specific crimes, atrocities, violations, etc., she does in her opening chapter set up a theoretical framework that I think is extremely useful, and in those italicized passages there calling for a sex-neutral term that can also encompass the targeting of boys and men along with women and girls. So that was a kind of pivot point for me to discover in terms of advancing my own inclusive understanding of this. Because I am not going to be talking about it much in this talk, I did want to acknowledge the extent to which we also now process concepts of gender in terms of sexuality and sexual identity. And I think it's particularly interesting that the one concerted attempt to revise the United Nations Genocide Convention and to re-examine the issue of protected groups under the convention, the 1985 Whitaker report, which was of course subsequently buried and has never been heard from again. But it's really notable to see Whitaker and his team noting the Nazi policy of targeting homosexuals, and then again in the italicized passage, it is recommended that the definition of genocide should be extended to include a sexual group such as women, men, or homosexuals. And of course we would today have a different term rather than just homosexuals, but it is, I think, a recognition even as far back as the mid-1980s that targeting according to actual or imputed sexual identity is an important part of understanding the place of gender in genocide. And those of you that have the third edition of the textbook can look at the gender chapter and read the fairly extensive box text that I have there talking about the vulnerabilities, particularly of gay men and trans women in the context of usually grassroots and security force organized vigilante campaigns, such as we see in countries like Brazil and Colombia, for example. One of the provocative contributions that I sought to make, or a theoretical framework that I think has some utility, is to distinguish between gendercide and root and branch genocide. I have argued that the vast majority of genocidal actions in human history fall into one of these two categories. Genocides, anyway, as traditionally understood. I will get back to that point in a second. But I invite you to note, first of all, that when we talk about root and branch genocide, that is, for me, a really interestingly gendered term, root and branch. It actually is a reflection, I think, of the reproductive capacity of the female of the targeted group. She is the root, and the child that is born is the branch. What is implicit here in this concept of root and branch genocide that we use a lot is the idea that the genocide is extending to children and women. And if that is the case, then the question remains, extending from whom to children and women? Implicit in this is a concept of a strategy of violence that targets, above all, people who are not children and women. And that is only one category remaining, which is adult males. So we will see shortly, I think, that the selective targeting according to gender, at least in these typical political military style genocides, tends to focus very strongly upon the younger male component of the group, and then may or may not extend to the root and branch category. It regularly does, and when it does, women are swept up into the kind of direct, mass murderous, exterminatory campaigns that we associate with the Japanese in China, or with the Nazis on the Eastern Front, or indeed the root and branch genocide, a classic root and branch genocide in Rwanda. We need also to recognize that to the extent that genocide stops short of a root and branch dynamic, it does not mean that women or children are being exempted from mass atrocity. Very typically, atrocities like, most obviously, rape and sexual violence, also the institution of the death march for survivors of original executions, and so on, tends, by virtue of elimination, to be focused very strongly upon the children and women and elderly of a targeted group. So please keep in mind what I am saying and what I am not saying about the gender-specific targeting. My own understanding of genocide does, I admit, tend to privilege the mass killing dimension, and that is somewhat controversial, as many of you will be aware. In genocide studies, how much should we prioritize the killing dimension? Women are very often swept up into that mass murderous dimension, and even when they are strategically exempted from it, they will be exposed to a whole range of other atrocities that are indeed facilitated by the gender-selective targeting of adult males. One of the themes that I have also wanted to look at, which I think our understanding of genocide tends to be too constricted, is the question of genocide and structural violence. And I think the gender dimension of genocide is particularly relevant here, and particularly relevant in the case of females. So again, although it's relatively straightforward to point to cases of genocide where women are exempted from the worst of the mass killing atrocities, there is, in many societies continuing to the present day, structural forms of violence which in many cases inflict death tolls that are far greater than all but the most destructive genocides in human history. Think of the death toll from female infanticide over the millennia, for the example. I wouldn't be surprised if it is comparable to the total number of deaths caused by genocides as understood in a political or military context. And so on that Gendercide Watch website, gendercide.org, I've included several case studies of female infanticide, maternal mortality, honor killings, as forms of female-specific structural gendercide. I think we need to keep this structural dimension in mind, even though it doesn't fit very easily with our more kind of event-centric understanding of genocide. We are in the field, I think, increasingly moving to an understanding of genocide as a process rather than an event. And that is beginning to open up more understanding, more analytical room, I think, for some of these structural features, which in the case of gender and genocide are probably, almost certainly, the most destructive forms of gender-specific targeting of women and girls. And there's a lot more work that remains to be done on these subjects, but I've tried to get some of these issues on the ground. When we talk about the traditional political military understanding of genocide, this is the core argument that I made in the first substantive article that I wrote on this subject, Gendercide and Genocide, in the year 2000. And this, I believe, was an important point to make, simply because understandings of genocide at that time, understandings of gender at that time, and still to a certain extent today, tend to be rather feminized. We think of a gender issue as being an issue that pertains directly to women and girls. My argument, again, from an inclusive perspective, is we need to understand the operations of this variable in a broad sense, and that when we look at the more event-based types of genocide that we are more traditionally referring to as genocide, there is this glaring phenomenon, as I see it, that the targeting of so-called non-combatant men of a battle age is something that you simply cannot ignore when you begin to investigate the unfolding of various genocidal processes and events over the centuries. And this, for me, I think is at the heart of political and military gendercides, because it is this group of men of a fighting age, broadly viewed, who are seen as the most threatening to the designs of the perpetrator group. Sometimes as a means to get them out of the way before the rest of the group is exterminated. Sometimes the targeting of this particular group more or less bounds the mass killing dimension of the genocidal enterprise. I'll return to that in a second. I'm sorry to present some of these images to you right after lunch, but this is an image that has had a particular power for me over the decades, from one of the mass graves excavated, exhumed at the Srebrenica massacre site in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Srebrenica, to the extent that we have any popular perception of the gendercidal targeting of males of a fighting age. Srebrenica is probably the iconic example. And it's just about the only one I can think of where it is quite common in the mass media to see it referred to as a massacre of men and boys. That is extremely unusual, and typically men and boys will be replaced by something like people or civilians or fighters or something that is implicitly gendered, but where the real nature of the targeting is somewhat disguised. A few comments on gendercide and genocide. I do think that gendercide is genocide. That is to say, it is not a separate phenomenon. It is a form and a strategy of bringing about genocidal destruction, destroying targeted groups in whole or in part, to use the language of the Genocide Convention. I've suggested that gendercide against non-combatant adult males may be the default setting for genocide, and typically is part of a phase model, where first of all you kill the men because they are deemed to be the most threatening to your designs. You also accustom the killers to the killing by first of all directing them against the people who require the least kind of moral justification to kill. There are often moral constraints that even mass killers will feel about killing children or women. And at that point, once you have that allegedly dangerous group removed and you have your killers acclimatized to the killing, you can then choose whether to move on to root and branch genocide against remaining sectors of the group, or is that mass killing of the adult males necessary and sufficient in bounding the strictly mass killing dimension of the genocidal enterprise? And I think accordingly, we can develop something of a typology of this type of genocidal strategy. In some cases, it serves as a prelude or an accompaniment to root and branch genocides. And root and branch genocides typically are the iconic ones in our minds: the Nazi Holocaust, Rwanda, Armenia, etc. In some cases, I think that killing of the targeted group is deemed necessary and sufficient, and the mass killing largely ends with that group. Bangladesh in 1971, Burundi in 1972, the Anfal campaign against the Kurds in Iraq, Chechnya, East Timor, Kosovo, a number of other cases. And I would mention also Islamic State recently in this context, which has in many ways a very classical approach to genocidal atrocities. And then finally, political repression with gendercidal overtones. One could argue that it has not come to the level of a fully fledged genocide, but that it exhibits some of the patterns and features of genocide. And when we look at cases from Latin America, like El Salvador, Peru, Colombia, which I have studied pretty closely, Jammu, Kashmir, and Punjab in India, Sri Lanka during the 1980s, or look at what has happened with the atrocities, I think many people call it genocide, against the Rohingya population of Myanmar in the last couple of years. That probably does spill over in many people's minds to genocide, but nonetheless features very much this gendered strategy of kill the men and then rape, expel, incarcerate, detain, whatever, the remaining members of the group. I think it's important to put gender in the context of other variables here. I'm sometimes asked, well, you know, are they targeting men because they hate men in the same way that women are targeted on grounds of misogyny? I think there is a little bit more to that than is generally understood, but in general the answer, I think, is no. Typically, of course, it is male perpetrators of the perpetrator group targeting males of the out group. And they are being isolated and defined and targeted originally not on the basis of gender, but on the more typical identities that we associate with genocide and its variants: nationality, ethnicity, race, religion, political group, and social class. Then you, on the basis of that kind of macro defining of the group, you break it down, I suggest, first of all by gender, and second of all by age. And you can see a kind of decision chain occurring here, where the decision is taken at first to target a group in general, and then at the level of strategy, gender combined with age is very significant. I do think it's really important in the case of men and boys to also look at the role of what I've called gendercidal institutions. I've looked at military conscription, I've looked at incarceration and the death penalty, maybe vigilante killings and lynchings. Those of you that are familiar with the politics of lynching in the United States will probably recognize the gender dimension there. But probably above all, gendercide by forced labor. One of the things that this inquiry into gender and genocide has led me to over the years is a sense that maybe forced labor, corvée labor as it is sometimes called, could be the most destructive institution in human history. And it is an institution which tends to be very gendered as male, and is, with this example from the Belgian Congo, for example, you often see in the aftermath of these kinds of systematic campaigns against the masculine component of a targeted group, some of the best evidence for that is often in the demographic statistics after the violence has concluded. And you see gaping gaps in the representation of males in the Congo, or in Stalin's USSR, and other cases where this kind of gendered approach to forced labor has been implemented. I do a lot of work on genocidal perpetrators, and I think it's really interesting to look at the mass of perpetrators in genocide who typically are men, overwhelmingly men of the perpetrator group. It invites some rather difficult and challenging questions. Are men inherently more violent and genocidal than women? Does that reflect nature or nurture or both? Does it reflect the politics of intra-male competition for power and resources and women? I think all of those dynamics are often evident in this targeting by men of an in-group against men of an out-group. And those kind of, the images there, which are from New Delhi in 1984 and Rwanda, the one at the bottom, are quite representative examples of this kind of collective male rioting, pogroming, and genociding of especially males of the out-group. It is interesting then to ask from the perpetrator side, what role do women play? And this is something that I think has begun to get increasing attention as some of the more idealistic understandings of women's role in society and women's nature, quote unquote, have begun to be challenged and interrogated, I would say especially by critical feminists, who find it kind of infantilizing to depict women as helpless victims all the time, and want to look at some of their role in shoring up and indeed implementing strategies of violence. We have the example of Rwanda, where women in large numbers at every level of the genocidal enterprise, from the top leadership right down to the people going into the churches full of bodies and finishing off the wounded and looting the corpses. We see a remarkable representation of women, albeit certainly no more than 5 or 10% of the total perpetrator group, but it may be the most dramatic representation of female perpetration in a typical political or military genocidal form. I think more typically, and reflecting the patriarchal exclusion of women from the sphere of policy making and political strategy, it is more typical for women to be cast in a supporting, or as I've called it, cheerleading role. And that is also very much evident in the Rwanda case, and very much evident or symbolized by that image of adolescent girls in Nazi Germany, and women, of course, were among Hitler's greatest fans and constituencies, and women went on to participate in important ways, which we're still coming to learn about, in the enterprise of the Holocaust, in the destruction of the handicapped and physically and mentally handicapped in Germany. And of course you have here at Claremont Dr. Lauer, who has made a seminal contribution to this study with her book Hitler's Furies, and examining how really at every stage of the bureaucratic hierarchy, women were represented and played a number of distinctive roles, from simply strategically supporting or bureaucratically supporting the enterprise, to being lovers with the killers, to being direct and sadistic perpetrators themselves. We have still, I think, an underdeveloped comparative account of this dimension of female perpetration, and there is important there's important further work to be done on that. Moving towards the conclusion, I just wanted to discuss a couple of final points, and I've always been very interested, maybe this is my journalistic and media background coming to the fore, but I've been very interested in the way that genocides are sold to societies, the way that they are presented as being defensible, necessary, urgent, typically by demonizing the targeted group in the genocide and presenting them as subhuman, dangerous, subversive, terrorist, etc. It's really interesting to look back through the record of Nazi propaganda against the Jews. And I have done a lot of looking at this. And in all of that surveying, I can count probably on one finger of one hand an image of a Jewish woman in Nazi propaganda. It is almost exclusively the case that the Jew that is depicted is a male, typically a sexual predator, dirty, greasy, disheveled, unclean, in league with Bolshevism and communism, an oppressor, note the whip in his far hand. What I'm suggesting to you is that these are accusations or stereotypes which are more easily applied to males of the outgroup. And you can do this test for yourself. Just think in your mind, terrorist, subversive, rebel, spy, predator, bandit, criminal, rapist, shyster, dirty, vagabond, all the kind of language that is so typically directed against targeted groups in genocide. Is it not the case that a masculine face appears in your mind when you think about those terminologies? Is it not more automatically associated in our minds with the figure of the male? I would argue that it is, and that therefore it is much more typical to see men being depicted, men of the outgroup being demonized in this fashion. Now, there are analogies for women, I think, with a narrower range of stereotypes reflecting the traditionally narrower range of social roles that women have been permitted to play under patriarchy or have been depicted as playing. And we see, for example, accusations of women being in league with devilish forces or supernatural forces. A lot of emphasis on women's sexual and reproductive capacities. So the prostitute or whore, as depicted here in Hutu propaganda against Tutsi women in Rwanda, the idea of women as a baby factory. But what I'm suggesting is that the range of stereotypes is more constricted here, that it tends to focus upon reproductive and sexual identities, and the range correspondingly of negative stereotypes directed against outgroup men is broader and in some ways more eclectic, I suppose one could say. I think it's also really interesting to look at the way, the gendered way in which the perpetrator group is encouraged and mobilized and validated in their genocidal enterprise. And again, the Nazis, with their construction of this rigid, phallic, look at the bayonet sort of rising up from crotch level in that image, steely-eyed, implacable male defending the Reich against or on behalf of whom? And that's the flip side of it in Nazi propaganda, is the woman, the German woman, as guardian of home and hearth, the one who needs to be protected in her family and her reproductive role. You can see the bucolic countryside behind her. She is the guardian of all that is good and traditional in German society. And the male, the genocidal SS officer, is then able to construct his role as being a fundamentally defensive one, protecting his, quote-unquote, womenfolk, as opposed to a genocidal one aggressing against neighboring populations. So just to conclude, I think that it's also really well worth asking, how does this fit in to our understanding of genocide prevention and intervention? And I think gender is very helpful here on a number of levels. Women and girls, I think we need to understand in particular that some of the more traditional exemptions of these classes of civilians in war, perhaps in the era of degenerate war, as Martin Shaw has called it, decentralized warfare featuring large numbers of roaming militias, etc. Perhaps also in this new age of warfare, women and girls are increasingly vulnerable to the kind of killing that often spills over into the genocidal. I think we need important understanding, and I think we're getting it, of rape and sexual assault. Ever since the Akayesu decision by the Rwanda tribunal, we have had a notion of genocidal rape, the rape of women as a form and strategy of genocide. I think that has been a very important advance, conceptually and legally. I think we need much greater attention to gendercidal institutions, because a great deal of the destruction that is wreaked upon women and girls will take that structural form rather than a more explicit and time-bound campaign. And if it is the case that women typically lose their menfolk in a genocidal campaign, that would tend to suggest that women would be disproportionately numbering among the survivors, and all of the humanitarian interventions that you would do on behalf of survivors would need to take that gendering into account. In the case of men and boys, I think we need to get away from some of our stereotypes that tend to depict men as exclusively the perpetrators or the agents of violence, and to understand that there are significant gendered vulnerabilities, particularly of non-combatant men. I think we need to be sensitive to the way that some of that gendered propaganda that I just showed you is preparing the path for a campaign against the men of an outgroup and perhaps a root and branch campaign. I think we need to understand the way that the targeting of males often works as a feature of so-called background state repression, that third category that I showed you on the slide, a few back. And those are the type of situations that typically spill over after a time into fully fledged genocide. And therefore, to an extent, when we see selective executions, roundups, incarceration, systematic torture, mass expulsion, terrorization of the men of a community, I think we are getting one of the most valuable insights that we can into a tripwire and a harbinger of a genocidal process. When we see state repression taking those forms, I think it is something of a canary in a coal mine. And we need to recognize that a larger scale and more indiscriminate campaign against the targeted group may well be on the agenda. And lastly, also, there is, I think, also a place for the structural and background institutional forms of gendered violence that can also target boys and men. So that is a very rapid and general overview of the ways that I think that this variable of gender can assist us in understanding better the nature and the dynamics of genocide. I thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome your comments. Exactly 1 p.m., not bad. Any thoughts? Anything you would like to follow up on? Because necessarily I was skating over a lot of big issues very rapidly. Go ahead.
I'm currently studying the genocide
Mm.
and I'm interested in understanding how, at the present moment, I know international law has definitely failed the Yazidis by not recognizing the genocide as a genocide until about 5 years ago.
Right.
But you're talking a lot about how rape and sexual violence has been used as a structural long-term genocidal tactic.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how prevention can be done beyond an international law, but from a foreign policy perspective to help, I guess, counter a lot of the long-term structure.
Yeah. Very, very good question. I think probably, first of all, it's worth noting that that dimension of sexual victimization factors into those humanitarian strategies towards survivors of a group. So one's sort of gendered strategies of humanitarian intervention certainly need to account for the reverberating trauma associated with, in the case of Yazidi women, not just rape and sexual violence, but protracted sexual enslavement. So I think there is a good understanding of that. In many ways, it fits almost frighteningly well with the kind of classical strategies of genocide that I referenced. Islamic State typically murders the males of an outgroup, the adult males of an outgroup, sometimes also the boy children, and then enslaves and exploits, or at the very best, expels the remaining members of the targeted group. So we're certainly getting a kind of insight into the way that genocide has typically operated throughout history. In terms of humanitarian intervention, I would say that there was a broadly pretty effective response in this case, that the sheer barbarity of the atrocities and the gleeful, there's not a lot of perpetrators of genocide who actually stand up in the eyes of the world and say, yeah, we are committing genocide and we're proud of it. That's effectively what ISIS said. And that the kind of shock of people kind of not only proclaiming it, but videoing it and circulating that over the internet was huge. I think a pretty effective coalition did come together that, with considerable violence and destruction, was able to roll back ISIS and to preserve the remainder of the Yazidi community, for example, and to liberate large numbers of Yazidi women from servitude. So in that sense, for a variety of reasons, and for the fact that ISIS really did not enjoy a great deal of sympathy or support from anybody, it was a fairly rapid, fairly effective, albeit with quite a lot of indiscriminate violence and bombardment of, ISIS-controlled populations and so on, that did succeed in reducing this genocidal force to a pretty marginal status right now. And I think probably the gendered atrocities, particularly against women and girls, were important in stirring up that collective sense of outrage and marshaling that collective project to ally and roll back the ISIS forces. Thank you. Okay, I'll take you first. Yeah, okay.
I have to ask, we stand on the precipice of potentially another genocide right now in the Kurdish regions there.
Yeah.
As Erdogan and Turkey come in with Russian backing and the role Assad will play there. So with your scholarship, to what extent can it anticipate or predict what's going to happen? Using your approach to this material, can we anticipate what's going to happen in the Kurdish regions? I guess the other question is, does the scholarship have an activist element too? Does this help us respond to what is potentially another genocide right now?
Yeah, does it have, I mean, I certainly think that all of the scholarship that I've done has some kind of an activist dimension. I think that's almost definitional in comparative genocide studies. I don't think any of us are really into it just because we think, oh, this is so interesting. We do think it's interesting, sometimes morbidly, but I think we also go into it with a kind of preventative goal in mind, and that we are constantly sifting the evidence for useful strategies of prevention and intervention based on the historical record. I would not personally, in the case of the current Turkish campaign against Syria, anticipate an ISIS-style campaign of unrestricted mass atrocity against the Kurdish population. I think the fact that Turkey is very aware that the eyes of the world are on it right now, the fact that Turkey is a member of NATO and it can be exposed to pressure from fellow members, the fact that I think Erdogan does not want to be seen as a genocidal thug, and self-perceptions are important here too. I think what you are perhaps witnessing is more along the lines of a classic campaign of so-called ethnic cleansing, where the focus is not so much on the destruction of the group as such, but on its removal and its translocation, this kind of security zone that Erdogan wants to set up. In many other cases, and I think this would be true for the Kurds in southeastern Turkey during the 1980s and early 90s, utterly true, classically true in the case of the Kurds of Iraq under Saddam Hussein. I think the Kurds very much, and Kurdish men and women alike, have been on the receiving end of many of these highly selective gendered strategies and massively destructive outcomes in human terms. I think for the reasons that I mentioned, I suspect that this is going to be a more limited agenda. I see Erdogan almost retreating from elements of it already. And I think that does reflect to a certain extent the positive transformations in global society that actors like Turkey, which are quite, unlike ISIS, quite heavily integrated with international organizations and with the international community, are vulnerable to the vigilance and the criticism and the sanctioning by that same community. I think Erdogan is cognizant of that. Thank you. Go ahead, yes.
Thank you. I'm curious as to where you fit the sexual enslavement and mass rape of Yazidi women. If you fit it into the category of the root and branch type of genocide or the killing
Right.
just given that there's the caliphatic aspect and then ISIS's desire to operate.
Right. You know, one of the real challenges that I face whenever everybody asks, you know, is X a case of genocide, is that I almost feel obliged to respond, it depends. And what it depends on, to a certain extent, is how you interpret and conceptualize genocide. And if you've read the first chapter of my textbook with its 3.5 pages of alternative definitions of genocide from the UN Convention 1, there is a lot of room for reasonable people to differ as to whether particular strategies should be viewed as genocidal in themselves, or as preludes to genocide, or as adjuncts to genocide. Now, my own framework strongly emphasizes the mass killing dimension. And in that sense, ISIS, I think, is a classical genocidal force in that its typical strategy has been to conquer communities, separate the adults of both genders, murder the men, and then to enslave and exploit, or at best expel, the women of the community. From that perspective, you would say, I think, that it is a classic gendercidal campaign which stops short of root and branch extermination of the targeted group. The counter to that conceptualizing and framing of it would be one that emphasizes a much more multifaceted aspect to this idea of destruction. And if you go back to Raphael Lemkin's original understanding of genocide as a coordinated series of strategies targeting the health, livelihood, physical subsistence, dignity of the targeted group. And at the end of that list, Lemkin says, and even the lives. I mean, he really does downplay the physically exterminatory dimension, and he is much more focused upon the destruction of the group as a social entity. And if you take that more sociological understanding of genocide, and I speak in the textbook about what I see these days as something of a return to Lemkin, perhaps particularly driven by indigenous people's experiences around the world of this kind of multifaceted cultural, sociological, physical targeting. The dimension of sexual exploitation, assault, enslavement, etc., becomes a genocidal strategy in itself. And I suspect that people that favor that approach to genocide would be less likely than I am to draw this distinction, for example, between gendercide and root and branch genocide. They would see it as a more totalizing, encompassing strategy where forms of physical violence and humiliation and indignity and uprooting and separating of the genders of the targeted group, all of these features would be seen as part of the wider destructive process. So it very much depends, I think, which framing you prefer. Any other comments, questions? Yes? Hi.
I was wondering how gendercide has changed over time, and if so, how do you think that's happening today?
How gendercide, not genocide, is changing over time. Fascinating. One of the questions that I have asked myself is, given how much of the targeting of so-called battle-age men is built around this notion, as the term implies, of them being militarily capable and at least potentially involved in military resistance, one of the questions I have asked is, as women become more and more militarized, that is to say, drawn in greater numbers into armed forces, particularly perhaps into more informal armed forces like guerrilla and militia formations, will the targeting according to gender and its supposed link to militarization change? My tentative insight into that is that these things are surprisingly sticky. The stereotypes of the past kind of linger in a present where the fundamentals may have changed. And so, for example, you still see a lot of that gendercidal targeting of younger adult men, even in contexts of counterinsurgency, where women might be 25 or 30% of the armed forces, the military force that is resisting the actions of the state. So as women become more integral to armed formations, will that construction of the gendering of armed formations change? I think it sort of remains to be seen. And one would perhaps predict that it would evolve over time. I think we still have only limited evidence of that actually happening. One other comment I would make on that is, particularly when we talk at the level of gendercidal institutions, interventions in things like female infanticide, maternal mortality, the nutritional and educational deficits of women, associated institutions like female genital mutilation, for example. What I think we have seen over the last half century in particular is an enormous amount of generally pretty effective feminist-inspired activism around those themes that I think has, for example, on the level of women's nutrition, women's education, intervention in the case of sexual violence and sexual assault, restrictions on FGM and female infanticide, as a result of both direct state policies and more sort of background structural evolution. I think that women's status, generally speaking, around the world has increased in the last 50 years, sometimes quite dramatically. Women are ever more present and active in politics. They are ever more present and active in activism around these issues. And I think that has made a limited but notable difference to the acceptability and ubiquity of those background structural forms of violence that I think historically have been the most destructive against women. And I see that increasing further in the future. Go ahead. Why there's gender-specific killing? I think so. The Nazi case is very interesting because you really do see a kind of blooding of the perpetrators, getting them used to their task by directing them initially against Jewish men. And then just a few weeks later, I mean, I'm talking about the Eastern Front in mid-1941, you get this switch to root and branch genocide. The most interesting, I think, extension of this reluctance to participate in the extermination of groups that are designated as non-threatening or requiring protection, children, women, the elderly in particular, is the institution of the gas chamber. And the switch in Nazi policy from the up-close and personal killing, root and branch killing, which was causing large numbers of German soldiers to break down and to request an exemption from these mass execution sites, particularly because of the killing of children and women. And, you know, people basically went to Joseph Goebbels, military leaders, and said, we can't go on like this. You see what it's doing to our men. They're becoming monsters. We have to figure out a way that can psychologically distance them from this extermination campaign. And I think it's quite clear that that was the grounds for the development of the death camp and the gas chamber as institutions, that you could then have a more hands-off and psychologically distant way in which, of course, for example, the people leading Jews into the gas chambers would often be Jews themselves, designated to do so, or local militias. You would preserve the noble German from having to get his, sometimes her, hands dirty with that enterprise. So I think that though that evolution of the genocidal project in the Nazi case was quite profoundly gendered in ways that we're still coming to terms with understanding. I think that would also suggest that similar kind of preoccupations and concerns exist in other cases as well. And so in those cases, for example, where you see men killed in a gendercidal way and women sexually abused, but more generally expelled or uprooted from the territory in question. I'm thinking Bosnia in the 1990s, Bangladesh in 1971, etc. One has to suspect that the fairly clearly demarcated dimension of mass killing and the near totality of its direction against the male cohort of the targeted group reflects a measure of hesitation, whether it is personal or moral or political, about being seen to target groups that are traditionally constructed as powerless or helpless or civilian by nature. I'm not sure how you would measure it, but it's a sense that I have of the comparative range of this. Of course, the fact that so many of those limited campaigns, those gendercidal campaigns, then become root and branch campaigns, suggests that whatever moral inhibitions people feel about killing so-called vulnerable groups can be overcome, and can be overcome pretty quickly and pretty completely. So I do not want to overstress their significance.
All right, that's all the time we have for questions, but join me in thanking Adam Jones.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. Thank you.